The roar of a chainsaw at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning is not something anyone expects to hear in a quiet suburban neighborhood, especially not when it's coming from your own backyard. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, the sound so raw and violent, it felt like it was ripping through my bones. I thought maybe it was a dream, or someone doing early construction down the block. But no, it was much too close, right outside my window. I scrambled out of bed, threw on a hoodie and slippers, and ran to the back door. I remember flinging it open so hard it banged against the wall. And there she was, Karen, my neighbor of 5 years. Tall, blonde, always overly confident, with that signature pair of oversized sunglasses that never quite left her face, even on cloudy days. She stood in my backyard, holding a roaring chainsaw like she'd been born with it, her mouth set in a smug line of self-satisfaction. And just a few feet in front of her, my cherry tree, my beautiful 30-year-old cherry tree, was already halfway gone. Limbs lay scattered across the lawn like fallen soldiers, torn from their place in the sky. The trunk was being sliced like a cake at a birthday party. I froze. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't speak. That tree wasn't just a plant. It was part of my home, part of my memories. I'd planted it with my father when I was a teenager. We'd picked out the sapling from a nursery an hour away because he'd insisted the best trees weren't found nearby. I remembered how we spent an entire weekend digging the hole, perfecting its placement, and patting the soil just right. Every spring, it bloomed with delicate pink blossoms that floated down like soft confetti. Every summer, it shaded my back porch and filled the air with a faint, sweet scent, and now it was being butchered by someone who had no right to even set foot on my land. "Karen!" I shouted, my voice cracking with disbelief and fury. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned off the chainsaw slowly, like it was a remote control she had all the time in the world to set down. She took off her sunglasses and blinked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. "Well," she began, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "Your tree was hanging over my fence. It's been dropping leaves and twigs into my yard for years. I finally got sick of cleaning up your mess." I stared at her. "So you thought it was okay to cut it down, without asking me?" She gave a shrug, that kind of dismissive motion only someone completely self-righteous can pull off. "The branches were on my side. I figured it was half mine. I'm just cleaning up what's affecting my property." My jaw literally dropped. "That's not how property lines work. You can't just destroy someone else's tree because it inconveniences you." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. It's just a tree. You'll live. Maybe plant another one. Somewhere it won't bother anyone." I felt heat rush up my neck. I was shaking now, partly from anger, partly from pure shock. It was like being robbed in broad daylight while the thief told you they were doing you a favor. I glanced at the ground and saw the deep gash she had already made halfway through the trunk. There was no saving it now. Even if she stopped, the tree was too far gone. "You trespassed on my property and destroyed my tree. That's illegal." Karen scoffed. "Are you really going to make this a thing? I've lived next to you for years. It's not like I did it out of spite. I just wanted to make things neater." I could barely believe my ears. She genuinely thought this was reasonable, that her version of neatness justified storming into someone's yard and cutting down a living thing that didn't belong to her. I looked around to see if anyone else was witnessing this madness, but the street was still and quiet. Most of our neighbors were likely still asleep or buried under Sunday morning rituals. I took a deep breath, trying to find calm in the chaos that had just hit me like a freight train. "You need to leave, right now, before I call the police." Her expression faltered for just a second, but she quickly masked it with a smug smile. "Fine. I was almost done anyway." She turned and walked back toward her yard like she'd just finished a chore and was heading in for brunch. The chainsaw, still warm, dangled from her hand like a trophy. I stood there alone for a long time, just looking at what was left of my tree. The stump, ragged and torn, looked like a wound. The branches, some still dotted with spring blossoms, were scattered across the grass, lifeless. The sun filtered weakly through where the canopy used to be, casting harsh light on what had been such a beautiful, shaded corner of my world. I knelt beside the stump, ran my fingers across the grainy surface. It felt wrong. Not just because of the physical damage, but because of the violation. That someone could invade your space, destroy something meaningful, and act like you were the unreasonable one for being upset. I picked up my phone. No yelling. No drama. No confrontation. I was done with all that. Now I wanted something she couldn't ignore, cold, hard consequences, and I knew exactly where to start. After Karen walked off like she'd just mowed her lawn instead of destroyed a piece of my life, I stood in my backyard for what felt like hours. I kept staring at the stump, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just imagined everything, that I hadn't actually watched my neighbor take a chainsaw to something that wasn't hers, with the casual arrogance of someone pruning a hedge. But the ache in my chest and the mess at my feet were both very real. I went inside, poured myself a cup of coffee with trembling hands, and sat at the kitchen table in silence. That tree had been part of my life for decades. I had pictures of my father standing beside it when we planted it, pictures of my nieces playing in its shade, and even one of my dog, Duke, barking at squirrels from its base like it was his fortress. Every year I'd strung up lights for the holidays, hung a swing from one of the thicker branches, even carved my initials into the bark once as a joke. And now it was gone, just like that, because Karen decided she didn't like raking up a few leaves. The longer I sat there, the clearer one thing became. I wasn't letting her get away with it. That morning I started with the arborist. I found a reputable one online, called them, and explained the situation. They sent someone out within the day, which surprised me. The man who showed up, Dennis, was middle-aged, weathered by sun and years of tree climbing, and had a voice like sandpaper. He crouched by the stump, examined the root system, took notes, and gave a low whistle. "She killed a healthy tree," he said plainly. "Could have lasted another 50 years, maybe more. Roots are still alive, though, for now." I nodded, jaw tight. "Can you write that up for me?" "Absolutely. I'll give you a full report. You'll want to include that if you're pressing charges or taking her to court." I hadn't even gotten to that part yet, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel more justified. I wasn't being petty. I was reacting to something that was actually wrong, legally wrong. Next up, the surveyor. I wanted zero ambiguity when it came to the property lines. Karen's smug claim that half the tree was hers needed to be demolished with facts. A young woman named Erica came out with her equipment 2 days later. She was meticulous, cheerful, and professional, and she showed me exactly where my property ended and Karen's began. "The base of the tree was fully on your side," Erica confirmed, pointing to the small flags she had placed. "It might have leaned toward her yard a bit, but everything that matters, roots, trunk, the majority of the canopy, was clearly yours. Can I get that in writing?" "Already in progress," she said, with a smile that made me feel a little less raw inside. With the arborist and surveyor reports in hand, I called my lawyer. Lisa and I had gone to college together, and although she worked in real estate law, she was more than equipped to handle this kind of dispute. I sent her the pictures I'd taken that morning. The stump, the severed limbs, Karen holding the chainsaw like she was posing for a suburban horror movie. Lisa called me the same evening. "This is good," she said, her tone sharp and focused. "Not good for her, of course, but you've got solid documentation. Clear trespass, destruction of property, violation of local tree preservation ordinances if we push it. Will we have to go to court? Maybe, but we'll start with a letter. It'll outline the damages, what we're holding her responsible for, and what we expect her to do to make it right. Give her a chance to settle this like an adult. If she doesn't respond, then we go further." I asked Lisa to go all in. not because I wanted revenge, but because Karen had to learn that actions like this have consequences. You can't just bulldoze someone's space and expect them to shrug it off. I wanted every dollar she cost me accounted for, and then some. The letter went out the next day. Karen received it 2 days later. I know, because I watched from my window as she stood at her mailbox reading it. At first, she looked confused. Then her mouth twisted into that same smirk she wore the morning she cut down my tree. She rolled her eyes dramatically, held the paper up like it was a piece of junk mail, and then audibly scoffed from across the street. I heard her scoff. I figured she'd ignore it. But then something strange happened. A few days later, a landscaping crew showed up in her yard. They brought shovels, pickaxes, and a compact excavator. Curious, I watched from my porch. They weren't planting anything. In fact, they were doing the opposite, digging. Deep. All around the border of our shared property line. Karen stood with her arms crossed, fuming and directing them like she was trying to command an army into battle. It didn't take long to realize what was happening. Lisa had added a clever clause to the letter, thanks to Dennis the arborist. Because Karen had destroyed the base of the tree, the extensive root system, now dying, could rot and cause soil instability. That made her responsible for safe removal. The roots had spread well into her yard, under her garden beds, around her decorative rocks, even beneath the new concrete path she had installed last year. The crew had to dig everything up, carefully remove the roots and reinforce the soil. She was paying for all of it. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a word. I just sat on my porch every morning with a mug of coffee and watched the chaos unfold. The yard she took so much pride in, her perfectly symmetrical flower beds, the little gnome statues she arranged by color, the bird bath shaped like a seashell, it all got torn up. Day by day, her side of the fence became a construction zone, and she still hadn't said a word to me. I didn't need her to, because even in silence, the message was clear. The consequences were just starting to sink in. Karen didn't think it was real at first. I could tell. When the legal letter arrived, she probably skimmed it with that same sense of superiority she always carried, like the world was just something in her way to be rearranged. But it was real. Every word, every clause, every carefully crafted line from Lisa's office was a mirror held up to her arrogance. And reality has a funny way of cracking smugness wide open. The letter explained that not only had she illegally entered my property and destroyed a living mature tree, but she was now legally obligated to address the consequences. The city ordinance was clear. If you damage a tree on someone else's land, you're responsible for the resulting hazards, including the root system. Karen probably thought cutting down the tree was the end of it. She hadn't realized she'd only lopped off the top of a much deeper problem. The arborist's report had been the key. Dennis had detailed how the roots, now severed from their source, would die, decay, and potentially destabilize the soil. Since part of the root system stretched beneath her property, and she'd been the one to destroy the tree, she was now the proud owner of a very expensive landscaping problem. Karen couldn't just ignore the roots either. If they weren't removed, the shifting soil could damage her patio, her garden, even the foundation of her shed. And now it was legally her problem. She didn't take it well. Within a week of receiving the letter, the landscaping crew arrived. Not just a lawn service or weekend gardener, but a full excavation team, licensed, bonded, and carrying industrial-grade equipment. I heard them before I saw them. The rumble of machinery echoed down the street, drawing out curious neighbors like squirrels to a storm. By the time I stepped outside, Karen's backyard looked like it had been swallowed by an archaeological dig site. The pristine garden beds she loved so much were now piles of churned dirt. Her white stones were tossed aside like discarded teeth. The path she'd installed last year, complete with solar lights, was being torn up, section by section. And Karen? She hovered like a storm cloud, arms crossed, her lips pressed so tight they looked drawn on. I watched her bark directions at the workers, point at things angrily, and even stomp back into her house once, slamming the door hard enough to shake her porch railing. I sat on my own porch, sipping my coffee in silence. I didn't need to say anything. Nature and the law was saying everything for me. Every day for nearly 2 weeks, they worked. The root system was far more extensive than even the arborist had guessed. Cherry trees, especially mature ones like mine, can send out roots up to 25 feet from the trunk. Karen had cut down the top, but underground the tree was still reaching, still holding fast to the soil. They had to dig deep, cutting and hauling away thick, gnarled roots that clung like fingers to the earth. I saw one of the workers pull up a chunk of root the size of a small log. He wiped his brow and shook his head as if to say, "What a waste." I agreed. Karen's garden, once her pride and joy, now looked like a battlefield. Nothing green remained. Her once flourishing rose bushes were gone. The ornamental grass she was so proud of had been trampled and uprooted. Even the bird bath was cracked during the digging. At one point, a section of her sprinkler system was accidentally hit, sending a geyser of water into the air and soaking her porch. I didn't laugh. Not out loud, at least. But the irony wasn't lost on me. Eventually, the workers finished. They packed up their tools, smoothed over the yard as best they could, and left Karen standing alone in the wreckage. She didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just stared at her once perfect yard like she was trying to will it back into place. Then came the invoice. I got a copy through Lisa. Karen's attorney had reached out by then, probably realizing this wasn't going away quietly. The bill came to $4,200. Between labor, materials, damage control, and the arborist's recommended soil stabilization work, Karen had paid a small fortune just to undo the mess she'd created in an hour with her chainsaw. That didn't even include the additional claim I'd filed for the tree's value. According to Lisa and Dennis, mature cherry trees of that size and health were worth thousands. Add in property damage and the trespassing violation, and Karen was now facing a second legal headache. She tried to negotiate, of course. Her attorney sent a polite letter proposing a settlement. Lisa barely blinked before shutting it down. We weren't interested in half measures. Karen had acted recklessly. She hadn't apologized, hadn't owned her mistake, and certainly hadn't shown an ounce of remorse. If anything, she'd doubled down on her entitlement, treating this like a nuisance rather than a serious offense. So, we pressed forward. Eventually, probably to avoid court and the embarrassment that came with it, Karen paid. Every cent. I didn't gloat. I didn't wave the invoice in her face. But the next time I saw her at the mailbox, our eyes met, and something passed between us. A flicker of understanding. She finally knew she couldn't bully her way through life without consequences. That morning with the chainsaw had cost her more than just money. It had cost her pride, reputation, peace. Meanwhile, I made plans. The stump of the old cherry tree still sat in my yard, a reminder of what was lost. But I didn't want it to end that way. I reached out to a local nursery and ordered a new tree, a red maple this time. They planted it in the same spot, young but sturdy, its leaves already whispering with promise. Around its base I added a small stone plaque with a message carved in clean, simple letters. Do not disturb. Roots, run deep. I didn't need revenge. What I had was better. Growth, grounded in truth, rising from the ruins. Spring turned to summer, and the maple tree began to stretch. Its young leaves unfurled into a rich, vibrant green, casting a soft shade over the yard that reminded me, in some small way, of the cherry tree that once stood there. It would be years before it reached the same height, but every inch it grew felt like a quiet triumph. It was more than a tree. It was a statement, a symbol. It stood on the very ground someone had tried to claim with arrogance, and it flourished not out of defiance, but out of resilience. Meanwhile, Karen's yard remained a scar. She had tried to salvage it. After the excavation and the root removal, She'd brought in a landscaping crew, different from the ones who'd done the digging. They laid sod, added a few flower beds, and even installed a small wooden trellis along her fence, maybe in a bid to restore some charm. But it wasn't the same. The symmetry was gone. The spark that used to be there, her carefully curated perfection, had vanished. And more importantly, the neighborhood had changed. People had watched. Neighbors talk. At first, it was whispers, curiosity, amusement, disbelief. But word got around quickly about what had happened, that Karen had taken a chainsaw to someone else's tree without permission, that she'd been forced to pay thousands to fix what she'd done, that she hadn't even apologized. Where she was once the center of the neighborhood garden club, she suddenly stopped getting invitations. The woman across the street, Linda, who used to wave enthusiastically at Karen every morning while walking her dog, started crossing to the other side of the street. The couple next door, who used to borrow tools and trade seasonal recipes, now kept to themselves. The air shifted in subtle, irreversible ways. Karen wasn't just the woman who trimmed too aggressively or kept her lawn too neat. She was the woman who crossed the line, literally and figuratively. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a small sense of justice watching it happen. But I never gloated, never rubbed it in. I stayed polite, calm, measured. I mowed my lawn. I watered my new tree. I waved at neighbors, hosted a small barbecue once the weather got nice. People showed up. People asked about the tree. I told the story calmly, factually. The truth was enough. Then, one evening in late August, something unexpected happened. Was sitting on my porch, as I often did, watching the sky bleed into dusk. The cicadas were humming, and the maple's leaves were dancing gently in the breeze. That's when I saw Karen walking across the lawn. No sunglasses, no clipboard, no superiority. Just her, empty-handed and quiet. I braced myself. I didn't know what she wanted, but I wasn't in the mood for another confrontation. I set down my glass of iced tea and stood up slowly. "Hey," she said, stopping a few feet from my porch steps. Her voice wasn't its usual clipped tone. It was softer, a little strained. "Evening," I replied, neutral. She looked at the ground, then at the tree, then back at me. "It's a nice tree," she said. I nodded. "It is." She swallowed, took a breath. I was wrong. The words hung there for a moment, carried gently by the breeze. I didn't say anything right away. I wanted to make sure I'd heard her right. "I was angry about the leaves," she continued. "It was stupid, and I don't know what I thought. That if I just took care of it myself, it'd be over, but I made it worse. Way worse. I know that." Another pause. She kicked lightly at the grass with her sandal. "I've been meaning to say something," she added, quieter now. "But it's hard. I didn't know how. And then the more time passed, the worse it felt. It wasn't much, but it was real." I studied her face. She looked tired, smaller somehow. Maybe it was the lack of armor, the missing sunglasses, the absence of that ever-present posture of superiority. Or maybe it was the weight of everything she'd lost. Not just money, but face, relationships, peace. "I appreciate that," I said finally. She nodded, eyes still on the tree. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know." There was a long, quiet moment, the kind that only happens when something heavy is being set down. "Well," I said, "you said it." Karen looked at me again, then turned and walked back across the lawn. Not fast, not defeated, just quieter. The next day, I found a small envelope on my porch. Inside was a handwritten card. Just a simple note, apologizing again, thanking me for not escalating things further, and hoping we could move forward, not as friends, but maybe just not as enemies. Tucked inside the card was a gift certificate to the nursery where I'd bought the maple tree. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The gesture was enough. Time moved on, as it always does. The maple tree grew a little taller, its trunk thickening, its roots slowly settling into the earth below. Karen started tending her garden again, more modestly this time. Fewer decorations, more native plants. One morning, I saw her helping an older neighbor with a bag of mulch. Another day, she handed off a plate of cookies to the new family 2 houses down. She was trying, and maybe that was the point. Some things can't be undone. The cherry tree was gone. But what came after mattered too. Growth doesn't always come from peace. Sometimes it comes from the rupture, from the fire, from the mistake, from the painful process of admitting you were wrong and choosing to do better. I paid a steep price, but so did I. I lost something precious, but I gained something too. A deeper appreciation for what it meant to stand your ground, to protect what mattered, to hold people accountable without losing yourself. In anger. And as that young maple tree swayed gently in the breeze, I realized something important. Its roots were just beginning to take hold. This time they'd grow undisturbed,